Hello and welcome to the Sound on Sound podcast channel about electronic music and all things synth. I'm Rob Puricelli, and in this episode I talk to musician, synthesist and sound designer Richard Barbieri. As part of Japan, Richard Barbieri soon became the thinking person's synthesist, famous for his rich and textural electronic backings that beautifully complemented the work of the other band members to forge what is still a unique sound to this day. Richard went on to work on a wide array of projects, some with fellow members of Japan, one of which introduced him to Steven Wilson. He joined Porcupine Tree in 1993, and aside from Wilson, is their longest-serving member to this day. After a 12-year hiatus, Porcupine Tree reconvened to write and record Closure Continuation, their 11th and some would say best album to date. I managed to catch up with Richard during rehearsals for the first leg of their tour to support the album, and began by asking him about his first exposure to and experience of electronic music.
I guess it was the first Roxy Music album. I was a massive music fan when I was a teenager, and in equal parts I liked progressive rock music and I liked glam. But in both cases, the first time I ever heard synthesizers being used almost as sound design was when I heard what Eno was doing with Roxy Music. And of course, previous to that, I wasn't a very good keyboard player, and there's no way I would have been able to be part of a band solely as a conventional keyboard player. It just wouldn't have happened. But on hearing what was happening with synthesizers and what he was able to do, then that gave me hope and inspiration. And then when I started working with synthesizers, I concentrated more on the sounds than I did the playing. So the controls were more important than the keys, and I tried to make one note do lots of things rather than play lots of notes. So I guess that's the first thing. And then I started to kind of look back at the history of electronic music, and I started getting into Stockhausen and all kinds of things, Daphne Oram, and
And what about your first instrument? Yeah, how did you then start? How did that manifest? Your interest into it, then actually using equipment.
It was a Micro Moog. It's fantastic. I've still got it. It's just to my left, and I think that came out in about 1976 or 75. And it's a great monosynth, and it actually has really good routing on it. I mean, you can do all kinds of programming tricks with it. And I kind of gravitated to that more than I did a Mini Moog, because I tried one or two in the studio. So that was the first time I started making sounds. And at first it was a bit ham-fisted and a bit cheesy. But by the second Japan album, I was starting to kind of create atmospheric sounds and thinking of music in terms of what the emotion is and what the kind of meaning is, and just trying to create a vibe rather than playing.
Right, yeah, because you've often described yourself as like less of a musician.
Yeah.
And that's obviously something that I guess you took from or got inspiration from Eno from.
I did, but also the fact that I had no training at all, and I have no concept of musical theory. So I'm not, in a way, that's a terrible weakness to have, but also I'm not bogged down by the convention of how things work necessarily. So I might not be able to sit in on many jams in a conventional sense, but I'm coming at it from a different angle, because I'm not bogged down by the theory and by the knowledge, let's say.
And is that does that provide a sort of balance within, for example, Porcupine Tree, where you've got somebody like Steven Wilson who clearly is, very well versed in all of that, and so the two opposites form a whole?
Well, actually, the two opposites in Porcupine Tree is Gavin Harrison and myself. Stephen claims to be more on my side. He claims to be a non-musician, but he's not going to take that award in the band. No. That's going to be me. And Stephen is right there in the middle, in that he has a musical dialogue with both myself and Gavin. But myself and Gavin are as far apart as we could be. And I think that's the strength of Porcupine Tree, and I think that's what makes us sound a bit different. So when I get a piece that's maybe written by Stephen and Gavin, when I listen to it, I don't start theorizing. I don't work out the time signatures. I completely ignore the time signatures. I do everything in 4/4, like a good 80s person should do. And so I start running sequences and running things in 4/4, and suddenly, of course, they're making interesting things with his signatures, which are in like 11, 13, 9. And I don't worry too much about the key and everything. I'm just trying to find interesting harmonically engaging things. So I come at it as a non-musician, and I think that's for the benefit of the band.
Sure. And was that the same in Japan? That kind of your interaction with the rest of the band?
I think so, to a degree, yeah. I mean, we were all self-taught. So probably I was more similar to Mick Karn. So Mick Karn had no kind of theory in that sense, but he had a great ear for music, and what he came up with was just, so unique. Steve Jansen was as a drummer, was a bit more wary of and knowledgeable about construction of things and the kind of science and the mathematics of it. But again, he came at it from a different angle. And he's one of the people who influenced Gavin Harrison so much, because Gavin couldn't hear his history. You can generally hear musicians' history, can't you?
Absolutely.
But with Japan, you didn't know where we'd come from, really, because we didn't know what the rules were.
So who are your synthesizer heroes growing up? I mean, you've mentioned Eno and Stockhausen. Were there any sort of powerful influences on your style and what you ended up doing?
There's tons of great electronic artists, but they're generally writing electronic music, and they're usually solo artists. You don't really hear electronic musicians within a group. You hear keyboard players who play synthesizers within a group, but not what I would call electronic. But in terms of what people did with the synthesizers, I was quite a big fan of Tom Dolby, actually, Thomas Dolby. I think he had an album called The Flat Earth, and some of the programming on that is great. It's really great. I love it when a synthesizer player programs in an abstract way, where they're actually programming environmental sounds and they're creating their own environment. Like Eno did that with African music. It was quite amazing. He did it with Roxy music. He created this whole battlefield with tanks and missiles and gunfire, all with the VCS3. So I love that kind of approach. And another amazing album is by Ryuichi Sakamoto. It's called B2 Unit, and it was one of his first solo albums, and it was all done on a Prophet 5. And he was recording that while we were recording a Japan album, and so we looked in on his studio recording sessions quite often, and amazing programming. All the bass drums, snares, hi-hats, everything is Prophet. That was very impressive. And even people like Joe Zawinul, in the jazz sense, he would always play the sound as it should be played, if you know what I mean. So he programmed, and he was well into African music and world music as well. So he'd program up these quite interesting, reedy kind of synths that sounded quite like ethnic instruments, and of course he'd play it the right way. And I thought that's one of the most important things is actually how you play something, how you play the sound.
You mentioned Sakamoto there. Did you work very closely with him during your time with Japan? I can't, because I'm trying to remember how that all crossed over, and I know he worked with David.
Yeah, he did. Not really. It was more a case of he was making his album, we were making ours, and he co-wrote one of the tracks. So he'd come in for the day and did all his stuff, probably in an afternoon. Yeah, very impressive. But he did use a terrible preset sound. The quacking duck sound on the Prophet 5.
Yes, yeah.
So that's a crime in my book.
You're well known for your use, particularly in the days of Japan, of things like the Prophet 5 and the Oberheim OBXA, and also there's you were quite keen on the Roland System 700 as well. Do these instruments still figure highly in your work today? And of course, certainly with the Prophet 5 and the Oberheim, they've had recent reissues from the actual companies themselves. I just wondered, do they still figure in your work today? And what do you think of these new versions?
Yeah, they do figure. I don't have the Oberheim, unfortunately, but yeah, I mean the Prophet 5 and the Roland System 700 Lab Series I've used on everything, every album I've ever made. So yeah, they're right to the fore. I like to have a kind of spectrum of different things. I'm using a lot of new analog as well now. There's a company called Dreadbox that make really nice little synths, and I've got about 3 or 4 of those, and I've been using those a lot. And the collaboration Roland did with Studio Electronics, it's an SEO2. Mm-hmm. I've got that just to my right, and I'm using that on stage, and it's really powerful. It's fantastic. I love it. Great for programming, as well as things like the V-Synth and classic, virtual analog stuff. The Access Virus Indigo. I've got 2 of those. I love them so much. They're amazing. So it's a bit of everything, and of course, a lot of the synths in Reason as well.
You've got a Prophet. You've got one of the new Prophets.
I have got
you?
the
The
new
desktop version. Yeah. How are you finding that?
Yes, it's great. It's great. I don't use any of the new features. I basically just want it to be the same as what I had. So I don't like velocity on synthesizers, and I kind of like aftertouch, but I just want it to be the same.
Yeah, and I suppose that ties in with the fact that you don't consider yourself a traditional musician, that things like velocity, which are kind of key to a classic performance player,
True,
not be so important.
True. I mean, I like controllers. I like to use controllers. That's why I like the V-Synth so much, because it's a huge amount of control over the sound. But yeah, with the Prophet, I tend to use the wheel, and I tend to use noise modulation rather than pitch modulation.
What is your approach to sound design? Because that's obviously where you've spent a huge amount of your career doing. Do you just spend time, coming up with patches and then just kind of add them to a virtual type folder somewhere, and then I'll use those later on? Or do you create patches specifically for tracks as part of that writing process of a song or an album?
Well, it's a little bit of both. But the thing, I think my biggest influence in my approach to sound design was when I was a kid and I used to listen to the radio, and it was a badly tuned radio, and I'd be under the covers at night listening, and you would get 2 stations at the same time combining, and often I would think that was the same thing. I thought it was an amazing piece of music until I realised that there was 2 things playing at once. So it all became about the context, and then sometimes I'd hear a lovely piece of music and there'd be a voice coming in. And I thought, that works so well. But of course, it was just coming from another station. And that was a big influence on me. Actual kind of sound design to create a mood. And I guess we kind of heard that. I mean, I love sampling. So that whole thing with Brian Eno and David Byrne, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, great example of sampling, DJ Shadow in the 90s. I love things that are taken out of context and placed into another environment. But going back to your question, I do often make sounds specifically for that piece of music, and it's usually based around the lyrics or the feeling that the track is giving me. So
you feed off that vibe.
I do. There's a track on the Porcupine Tree album, a new one called Dignity, and it's taken from a piece that I wrote. So I co-wrote it with Stephen, and once he'd written the lyrics and he presented the track back to me, I had the storyline. So then I could really elaborate even more. And it was kind of like the life of this person who ended up homeless. And I took it right back to the early days of this person at school. So I created this whole playground environment. It's things like that, Sometimes I latch onto just little phrases or words, and I'll kind of create a sound response to it.
So imagine that you're stranded on a desert island and you want to do some sound design work. What's the one thing you'll always go to do something? Is there an instrument in your collection that you always go to start with, maybe, to create sounds?
That's interesting, because I suppose you would have the widest range or palette of sounds on possibly a more digital based synth, like a more thing that would have wavetables and would have kind of different shapers, and so in a way you'd have more scope. Whereas of course it's not as nice as pure electronic, semi-modular synth but yeah, I think I would go for an all-in-one type thing where I could actually create music that had a wide sound palette, including percussion and all sorts of things. So yeah,
I mean, would that maybe be a sampler or something? That
possibly. I think this Access Virus 2 is just amazing. I love it. Probably take something like that or the V-Synth.
Coming back to sampling, because sampling is something I wouldn't have normally associated with somebody like yourself. I've always seen you as the kind of the analog synth programmer. Tell me a little bit about your history with sampling. What tools were you using when you started, and what do you use now?
Well, I remember when we were doing Tin Drum, David was putting in samples into the tracks, and we were doing it via like a Walkman with like some traditional Japanese folk music or singing, and we would have that gated so that every time you played a note on the keyboard, it would trigger the sample that would be running. And so obviously it's all about an accident and finding the bits where it worked. It's a lot of trial and error. But when you got it in the right place, it was amazing, because you're hearing this vocal and you're thinking, I love it. And how could that happen in any other environment? How you'd never have got that. So that we were doing it right back then. And then, of course, as I mentioned, those albums as well that I love. And most of my solo albums and the albums I made with Steve Jansen and Mick Kahn, they all have a large amount of sampling in there, a large amount of external sound sources.
Were you using any specific hardware? Or?
I instead of putting them into a sampler, I put them into the redrum.
Okay, yeah.
Randomly. So I'll have sort of 16 channels of different samples at different pitches happening at different times. And I'll just key in some basic, I won't even think about the rhythm. I'll just key in a few, steps and then start running this. And you sort of step back at that point and you start listening, and you come at it more like a producer. You think, hang on, that was amazing what I just heard then. And then you find what that was, and then that becomes part of it. So it's a lot of experimentation, really. But again, it's starting from an abstract point. If you put something in a sampler and you start playing the keys, well, you know what it's going to sound like. So I like to set these things in motion that kind of aren't me. I mean, I'm making them happen, but I'm detaching myself from it.
So it's kind of like a conscious decision of yours to make your instrument sound more organic and natural rather than inherently synthetic.
Yes, although of late I've kind of, I enjoy listening to very synthy music. There's something very satisfying. I just think it's how it's used. But I was never that type of player, I guess. I was never went for those kind of obvious sounds, although they are very nice. I do like them. Like an album like Blade Runner, a soundtrack like Blade Runner. I mean, it's as synthy as you can get, but it's just such a beautiful sound.
It's definitely a benchmark.
Yeah.
So you mentioned redrum there, which obviously is a component of Reason.
Yep.
And in a recent video that I watched where you went through your rig, you have some of the hardware that you've mentioned, the Prophet and the Access viruses, and slap bang in the middle is a MacBook and you say, I'm running Reason, I use a lot of software instruments, which pleased me greatly because I'm a big Reason user, have been for many years, and I've known that you've used Reason in the past, and I was delighted to see that that's still something you're into. So can you tell me a little bit about why you use Reason? What makes that stand out for you over and above some of the other tools that are out there?
Well, I think I found something that worked for me, that helped my creative process. And I wasn't sort of concerned as probably my fellow musicians are more with recording acoustic instruments, the technical side of it. That wasn't an issue for me. It was about being creative and being able to work in lots of different ways in sync, and also now being able to record audio, and also now being able to use third-party VSTs. And it works for me. I mean, they get a bad press, and rightly so, really, because they're quite happy to portray themselves as less than professional in a way. It's people are a little bit snobbish as regards it, but I think they should use more examples of other types of musician, other kinds of composers. After sort of 12, 13 years, they're still reverting back to this four to the floor kind of demos that people were making like 20 years ago. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
And it's like a DJ thing, and it's just, I just think they should get some different people on board, really. But anyway, that's not my concern. It works for me. I like it. Another thing I like is adding in, apart from the samples, I like this grain table synthesizers, which are samplers as well. So you can put in musical passages or vocals, and then you start messing with the time and with the whole structure. You're actually moving the molecules around, the atoms, into a different order. And that, combined with the other samples as well, takes you into otherworldly places.
Do you use Reason as a sound design tool as well as a recording and sequencing environment? And what's your sort of process?
I do. And again, it's like trying to find the unconventional way of going about things. Like I use the graphic EQs as an effect, as filters for my sounds in real time. I love the fact I can record everything, obviously, in real time, so you get all those control movements. So often, instead of using the filter on a sound, I'll use that, because I can really pinpoint certain frequencies and bring out sounds that I probably wouldn't be able to with any type of step filter or ladder filter or whatever. So maybe basically it's using things for the wrong reasons, using the wrong things for the right reasons.
True.
As I say, I use the drum machine for firing off samples and for triggering other synths. I use a pattern sequencer linked up to the grain table samplers. So I'm giving myself random rhythms there that is creating these weird things. And then I'll use unconventional time signatures and then forget about it. So something might be in, instead of putting 24 steps, there'll be like 21 steps, and you'll just get this overlapping where you're getting events that don't happen again. It's all about creating movement, and it's going right back to what we said at the beginning of not being able to play proficiently. Therefore, I tried to make as much movement in the sounds as possible.
Do you use Reason live as well as in the studio?
I do.
And is it do you use it in the same ways, or are you using it simply as a host, or do you use the sequencers live?
No, I don't use the sequencers live. No. Anything that's heavily sequenced, we put onto backing, because there's no point. There's no point taking up time on stage controlling sequences when you could be doing other stuff. But yeah, I use it for a whole load of instruments. Also, I like to divide things up along the keyboard, so it's really handy when you want to produce a lot of kind of textural changes, and you can basically divide the keys up however you want. That's a luxury. I mean, I could do a whole gig with it, I think, but I don't want to get too much into that because I like the physicality, and I don't like controllers with messing around with software. That worries me.
Your live rig, you've mentioned the viruses and the V-synth as well, and some of these little tabletop modules, so we call them that. Yeah. What sort of things have you got there? Because so I noticed the big keyboards, but you've got a table of stuff in front of you with effects and small boxes. So what have you got there?
Well, onto one side I've got like a tabletop with there's a Nord Lead A1 which is just controlling Reason, the laptop, just because I like the feel of it. It works well with it for me. Next to that I've got the little Roland SEO2, the analog synth. I've got this is interesting. I've got the loop station, the Boss RC505. With 5 stereo loopers. I think it's about 3 hours, 2.5 hours of stereo recording. I mean, that is really useful. So I can use that in different ways. I can bring anything from my rig into it and start building up a textural thing. I can have samples that I can trigger off from it. I can have things backed up to it. It's really handy. I use that a lot. I've got the new Prophet, the little desktop version, Prophet 5 desktop version. And as you mentioned, an Indigo Virus 2, the V-Synth. A workhorse kind of Nord Electro for the, the mellotrons and the pianos and organs, different combinations. And I realised, because I couldn't get some of the same sound, I'm taking along the old JV 2080, just because we're doing a few things from the past, and I kind of think I got the sound right at the time, so I just want to, I want that there.
So you mentioned you're doing some of the old tracks as well as the new tracks. When do you start the tour, and what can we expect to see in that show, if you can talk about that?
Yeah, well, it's going to be a long show. There'll be an interval. We'll play all of the new album, not in sequence, but throughout the evening. And we'll focus on the other 2 albums that we feel are the strongest, which is In Absentia and Fear of a Blank Planet. But we'll also do older stuff as well. So a few selections of older stuff. And 1 or 2 things we've not played live before. So it'll be a bigger production. I mean, there won't be any gimmicks, but there'll be a bigger screen. There'll be, obviously, a lot of these venues we're doing, they're like indoor arenas. So it's the first time we've done this type of show. And when you go into them, they're just a box. You've got to build everything from the rigging to you've got to build the whole production and take that around with you. So we've got, 3 buses, 4 trucks, a whole large crew, which we've never used to have. So we need to project. So that's what we're going to do. But I think the main thing is after all this time, I think people come in, they want to see the band. So we're not going to blind them with some stage show or some, kind of concept or storyline or whole. We'd like them to be able to see us as a band and be able to connect with us.
Is it just going to be the 3 of you playing, or will you be bringing in other musicians?
We'll have the same kind of lineup. So there'll be another guitarist, a backing vocalist, and a bass player. So it will be the same as we had before, but
Sure.
different.
Because Stephen's done a lot of the bass on this new album, hasn't he?
He's done all of the bass.
All of it, right? Okay. So obviously, drafting somebody else in to do that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean the whole album, although it has the PT Porcupine Tree DNA, and it still sounds like us, it's very different for a number of reasons. And primarily, I think it's because Steve's playing bass. He plays in a totally different style to our previous bass player, and he's a guitarist, so he plays it like a guitar. So it's more in the sort of Chris Squire, Geddy Lee envelope, I suppose. More melody, more aggressive. It's the first time that there's only been 3 people on the album. There's no orchestrations, there's no guest musicians. That's different. The tracks, apart from one, are all co-written. That's new. So it's a complete collaboration between the 3 of us. And we made the album over a long period of time, for the first time in our careers, without any pressure. We didn't sign any contract to make this album. Nobody knew we were making this album, and we knew that at any point we could throw it away. And once you know that, it frees you up beyond belief. And it was so enjoyable doing that without a schedule, without any pressure. So it feels very different for us.
Was that brought about because of the pandemic? The fact that you just had time to sit there and do this stuff without any commitments or external influences?
Well, the pandemic speeded up the process. It made us finish off the album, basically. But the majority had been written over the previous 8 to 9 years.
Okay.
So there's no concept to the album because some of the songs are 10 years apart. But each song has its own story. That's why kind of the concept for us was the title of the album, Closure/Continuation, and that's more about us. We don't know if it's going to continue or if it's the end.
And you're free to make that choice.
We're free to make that choice again, and there's no. Why would we put pressure on ourselves?
Yeah, because Porcupine Tree's been on a hiatus for like 12 years, I think, isn't it? And what was the spark to do this? What prompted this desire to make another album? And was it an easy choice to get back with Gavin and Stephen after such a long time? And I don't know if you guys constantly kept in touch across those 12 years.
We did. We were kind of quite proactive on a musical level and on a social level. So I wouldn't like too long to go by without saying hello to the guys or seeing them or going for a meal or a drink or sending them some music, whether the band was going to happen or not. So the 3 of us were fairly proactive on that. But I think it could only have happened after this period of time, because when we finished Porcupine Tree, it wasn't a great feeling. We'd just been doing it too long, too much touring. We should have had a break before then. So I think the friendship suffered, the music I think suffered, and I think it plateaued for the first time in our career. And I certainly didn't want to have that as the last Porcupine Tree album. So it happened gradually over this period of time. And I think the fact that Stephen's had like 10 years of a solo career, that enabled him to draw a line between the two things. And he's kind of come to Porcupine Tree now, not as a control freak.
Right.
He's come to it as a collaborator. And that was really nice.
One of the things that Porcupine Tree certainly stood out for me was Stephen's adoption of using 5.1 mixes in a number of the releases. Because I think, I can't remember which album it was, but it was Elliot Shiner in the US. Yep. Did a version, Stephen didn't like it, so then went over, and that kind of started the ball rolling. And of course, he's become almost like a household name for that kind of thing these days. The new album is in 5.1 and Dolby Atmos.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, A, how does that sound? And B, as a sound designer who is whose main focus is creating soundscapes and evolving sounds, does the 5.1 and Atmos environment provide you with an even bigger canvas on which to paint, and do you relish that?
Well, I'll let you know when I hear it. I'm the only one not to have heard it in surround Dolby Atmos.
Oh, right.
There was a preview of it in London last night. I couldn't make it, so it's Soho. So I missed out on that. But I'll get to hear it one day, and I'm sure I'll really enjoy it. I've listened to our previous 5.1 surround mixes. I don't have a system set up for that. I don't know what I feel about it. I mean, it's great, if you can choose where you sit, it's fantastic. You choose the best seat in the room, and then you get the full effect of what it's for. If you move or you go somewhere else, or you just then I don't see the point. Suddenly you've lost it. That's why I don't see the point of doing it live. I know Stephen really wanted to do something surround in the live sense, but we kind of outvoted him on that, because you can't have somebody coming along and paying £100 for a ticket or something, and they're seated right next to one speaker, and they're not getting no perspective of what the track's about.
Yeah. And I saw him on one of his solo shows at the Albert Hall, and that was allegedly presented in quadraphonic.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to sort of understand how good or bad that was, given that the Albert Hall has such great acoustics anyway. I wasn't entirely sure how much it was giving to it or even taking away from it. But as a musician that's recording, I'm guessing that yourselves, or maybe just Stephen on his own, are always thinking about how this might translate into a larger, multi-channel audio mix.
Yeah.
And so does that impact the way that you record, the way that you compose?
It does, totally. We produce these albums together, and the album is mixed as you go along. There is no mix. It's not like the old days where you'd go into a studio, pull all the faders down, and you'd have nothing, and you'd start from scratch. It's not like that. The mix is something in development all the time, and you react to that. So it's a production decision. It's a musical decision. Once things start working well in context and they're in the right positions, and you find that right position and that right frequency, well, then that's a keeper. And the next person who reacts to it does so with that in mind. And that's kind of how I look at it, because being in a rock band, I've always had to try to find the space. And on this album, there's far more space than previous, because Stephen has kind of disengaged the guitars. I mean, he's down to one guitar, really. So there's none of this thick overdubbing and heavy riffing. He's in love with this Telecaster that he's using. And it's dynamic and it sounds great, but because there's just one of them, you can place it and it frees up so much space. So the mix is in progress, and at one day the mix just ends, and you think the track's done. And of course, it's very cinematic. The whole Porcupine Tree sound is very widescreen, so it lends itself obviously to surround in all its forms.
Of all the Porcupine Tree albums that have been, and we're going back, some way, where does the new one sit in your estimation of, the best work that you've done?
Well, it's right up there. I mean, I think we all agree that In Absentia and Fear of a Blank Planet to date were the best two albums that we made, and this is along with those. We don't know yet whether this is our best or not. It could well be our best. Obviously, you feel stronger about that at the time you're making it, and soon after. It will take a few years before you look back and reposition maybe where this album goes. But I think we're all pretty confident that it's up there with the best work we've done.
And the title of the album suggests closure stroke continuation, which is clearly what this album was about. It was about drawing a line under those 12 years, and now we're going to move forward and do this work. Can we expect another Porcupine Tree album after this one, or is that just dependent on the response you get or the feeling that you have after you've come off tour?
We really don't know. We're not playing any games here. We really don't know, and we like the fact that there's no pressure. We made this album under no pressure, so it would be silly to put ourselves under pressure. If it's the last thing we do, then we'll be quite happy, because we'd have made a great album, and I think we'd have ended up on a fantastic tour, and we've ended up with a kind of good friendship. All the things that we didn't have on the 12 years ago. So for me, that's I'd be happy with that. But on the other hand, if we find that there's something that we can do that's new, that we can keep the Porcupine Tree sound, but maybe widen the perimeter a little bit more. I mean, on this album, there's a few tracks that are pushing on the perimeters of what is the Porcupine Tree sound. Stephen is now very interested in synthesizers and keyboards. That's kind of his direction. Who knows? In maybe a couple of years, we might have some new recordings. But with the music industry, you don't know. Maybe there are no more albums. Maybe people just release tracks now. I don't know.
Because I was going to say the freedom that you clearly now have and that you are clearly relishing is born out of an industry that has changed dramatically since you first got into it, where you were very much in a machine, shall we say, a label and marketing and all that kind of stuff. Whereas nowadays, as an accomplished, successful musician, you have the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want, put it out in whatever form you wish. And that freedom is completely different to the way it was before. Is that a good thing in your mind?
I think we can't change our relationship with the album as a presentation of a work. That to us is kind of written in stone almost. And we're of that generation. I can't believe how lucky I am that I can go into a record shop and buy an album for £10. Buy a work of art for £10. For me, that's incredible. But for most people today, that would be a rip-off. I'm not paying that amount of money for music. So, no, we don't see it. We see it in the traditional sense that we need this format of an album to present a piece of work. There's no compromise on that. But we're probably the last generation that are gonna feel this way or possibly work this way. And yeah, it does change a lot of things. It changes record sales now. I mean, chart positions are now determined as well as physical sales on streams. So, it's how many people listen to your album. But they might have just listened to like 30 seconds or something.
It's funny because you mentioned that, and clearly Porcupine Tree are always looking to release physically as well as digitally, which is admirable and great, and people of our generation will obviously welcome that.
Yeah.
But it was interesting. My children, my daughter's 18, and in the last couple of years, she's got into buying physical products, albeit CDs.
Yeah.
Unlike her father, who's got a big vinyl collection, but she's buying CDs, and she appreciates the physicality of that, and not just listening to the music, but arranging them in a particular order and the cover art and all of this kind of stuff.
Well, maybe it's an inherent thing, Maybe
it might be, an influence.
Yeah, maybe that will never quite go away.
I mean,
it's not that we don't like new artists, I mean, we're massive Taylor Swift fans. We like Harry Styles. They're making great music. These are important artists, but they're likely to just drop an album out of the blue. You know what I mean? It's not a traditional thing. It's not. Then things work in a different way now. But I still think there's always going to be great music out there and great artists. It's just how the public consume that. And at the moment, obviously, the direction it's going in is that music is an accessory to their lives. For us, it was our life. That I could quite happily sit at home and listen to 3 albums. Who has the patience to do that now?
what do you think of the reissue business? Because obviously with vinyl making a big comeback in recent years, there's been a clamoring to reissue, albums from the past. And, Japan have had, Quiet Life just not long ago was released in a super deluxe edition set. What are your thoughts about, reissuing old content and adding in those extra tracks and putting it into new packaging?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the extra tracks. I've always been a bit... I'm a bit of a stickler for the album, and that's the piece of work. And I love reissues because I buy the same albums again and again.
Yeah,
I'll end up with 5 or 6 copies of the same album, but I love the fact that the packaging is there's more quality to it now. The reissues used to be quite it was arbitrary as to the quality you'd get, but now some of them are fantastic. And of course, being somebody who got rid of all my vinyl,
oh no,
yeah, in the 80s probably, I'm now on a quest to sort of at least get my top 100 albums back on vinyl. So I'm enjoying buying these things. I'll listen to high res though of it. I'll get the code and download it and listen to that. But just having the album there, it's just fantastic. So yeah, I'm all in favour of it.
Moving back to music technology, what excites you today? What products are you seeing, be it hardware or software, that really give you that kind of buzz that you got, maybe say in the early days when you were first discovering that that Micro Moog or the Prophet 5? Is there anything that really makes you very excited for the future of electronic music technology?
That's really difficult. I used to have endorsement with Roland with the V-Synth. I was involved in that whole programming and then promoting it. And I went to Japan and I spoke to the head guy there.
Kakahashi.
Oh, of course, there he is.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And he probably says the same to everyone, but he asked, he said, what do you think the future is of, how's it? And I got very tongue-tied and I was trying to explain how I felt that if these instruments could be played physically in a different way than resorting to the keys as we know them, then I thought there would be possibilities for making a new kind of sounds and a new sort of forms of music that you wouldn't get without that theory. But it got very deep and I didn't know, and I got a bit confused, and I was thinking of like gel pads and sort of things that your fingers would immerse into, and it all became a bit, in the end you realise you've just got a rubbish idea probably.
Well, you say that, I mean, you're talking about gel stuff. There's this controller by Rowley called the Seaboard, which is that kind of, it's kind of gel and it transmits MPE so you can get really expressive. So maybe that was kind of what you were thinking of back then.
I like that, where you take the keys out of the equation. And some composers used to write music in a different way, didn't they? They used different diagrams and symbols. And I kind of like the way of composing in a more abstract way, or creating your own table of scales or events. I'm not sure, but there's lots of interesting products without keys. These kind of pads and different. That they always interested me, and I wonder whether that could be taken a stage further. But no, I mean, you tell me. Have you heard something that's vastly different recently?
No, and that's one of the things I often have conversations with people about. Back in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a lot of innovation. It seemed that every 2 or 3 years, maybe less, sometimes a little more, there was a big leap. We went from analog synthesizers to digital synthesizers, be it FM or wavetable. Then we had sampling, and then we had physical modeling, and there were leaps and bounds in the 90s in that regard. And then all of a sudden, everything just became very bland and sample-based, and many big, powerful synthesizers just relied very heavily on a huge amount of samples. it seemed to stagnate for a number of years. I think we're seeing a lot of more innovation today than we've done before, but it's always in different, paradigms. Maybe it's a touch-sensitive keyboard, maybe it's something that's screen-based, maybe it's something on an iPad, but there doesn't seem to be. Maybe it's just because I'm an old man, but it doesn't seem to be those kind of leaps and bounds. It's a very slow process. But no, I don't know. And personally, there are a number of things that are very interesting to me, but whether they're the next big thing, I often try to think, what's that next big step? I mean, AI is something that gets often talked about. I don't know. What are your thoughts on artificial intelligence within music generation?
I heard a song made purely with AI, and it was fascinating. I really liked it. It had melody, but it didn't make sense.
Right.
It wasn't used in the way that you couldn't predict what was going to happen next. And that's an interesting part for me. The boring part of AI is, I was talking about this with Stephen Wilson, and he said to me he thinks that soon we're going to get to the point where you're just you come home from work and you'll switch on your machine and you'll say, can I have an Elvis Presley type of moody song, but with sung by Freddie Mercury? And that's exactly what you'd get, because they'd have every component they need to make the thing you want.
Scary.
It's kind of scary. And I mean, we've got concerts already, haven't we, where you're getting virtual, like holograms. And so I suppose artificial is going to be the big word, isn't it? I mean, is there going to be, is artificial going to be a good thing?
Yeah, who knows? Who knows?
Less realism.
And on that depressing note, Richard, it's been an absolute honour to speak with you. Thank you ever so much for your insight, and the best of luck with the new album and the tour.
Thank you very much. Good questions. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information along with web links and details of all the other episodes. Before you go, make sure you visit the Sound on Sound podcast page at soundonsound.com/podcasts, where you can explore all the other great content playing across the other channels. I'm Rob Puricelli, and this has been a failed muso production for Sound on Sound.